Well, we're hoping to get a screen for you guys. I've got one. For now, anyways. Till I brag about it. I went back there and there's nothing there. It's not like it was with all the cables everywhere. So they must have started rerunning things in the attic. Maybe there's not any of the connections that, no. There's a few small cables and stuff, but nothing where you can manipulate anything. If you'd like to open your Bibles to Mark. Josh will be all excited that we're going to be in Mark tonight. And Corbin. We will be in Mark chapter 6. For part of the lesson tonight. I have a couple articles here that if you are interested in reading further on what I'm going to present tonight, you might find this stuff interesting to look at. It is a little bit elevated reading, I guess. They're scholarly articles, so it is a little bit more of a challenging read than I would say just straight The Unseen Realm is. But it's not an impossible read. But we're going to get into first the teens and I have been going through Mark. If you haven't seen, we've been pulling it out there on Wednesday nights and going over it. And we made a scroll. It's about 25 feet long. We took out, it's just the text of Mark. Took out the verse numbers, the headings, all of that stuff. It's just the words. And it reads, if you've never read your Bible that way, I suggest you try it. Go to BibleGateway.com and you can click on settings on there and you can take out the headings and verses and all that extra stuff. And it reads like a novel. And you kind of lose yourself while you're reading it. So I find that, a couple hours of reading Mark and I'm just about done. Because you just kind of lose yourself into it and one thing leads to the next. And where otherwise at least I find when I'm reading it in my Bible, I get to the end of the chapter and I automatically want to stop. And it's kind of like that thing that happens when you walk through the door and you forget what you were there for. And that same thing happens, I think, to us when we hit that chapter 6 or chapter 7 or whatever it is. Our mind automatically forgets what was before. So I would suggest that you try that sometime and just read through something with that in mind. Now, with BibleGateway.com, it's a good resource. You can choose your version that you want to read. They do have other things, and of course, if you're online, you can do a lot of searches that way. That's mostly what I use for slides and things, just because I can copy and paste. But you'll only be able to get a chapter at a time. So what I do is, if I'm going to do something like that in order to make the scroll, is I copy and paste the entire chapter, put it into a Word document, and then just keep adding the ones behind it, and then I've got a full document. Nothing? Okay. So we'll have nothing tonight for slides for you. Hopefully we'll make this translate pretty well. So just a real quick overview of the scroll that we're going through with Mark. The idea was for us to read through Mark and kind of look for what is Mark doing. He's not just relaying the details of this happened and then this happened and then this happened and then this happened and so on. He's telling a story. He's telling a narrative. And when he's doing that, he's putting things in certain orders. And he's doing certain things. He's alluding to certain passages in the Old Testament. He's also alluding to his own book. And he's doing a bunch of different things. And so that was kind of our challenge was, we're still going through it, is what is Mark doing? And so the more we read it and we go through and we're looking at various things, the more things that we identify that, ooh, this is really interesting. What's he doing here? And then we'll look and we'll see where something that scholars have noticed with Mark a lot happens in other places as well, are what they call Mark sandwiches or Markan sandwiches or intercalations, where he has one detail here and another detail here that are similar, and you're supposed to understand, or the story is interrupted. So a really good example of this is when we have the woman with the issue of blood that is, Jesus is walking with the crowd. This interrupts the story of Jairus' daughter. Jairus comes up to Jesus, my daughter's dying, or she's ill, you can make her better. It's interrupted by this woman as they're on their way. And then the story continues with the servant coming up and saying, she's already dead, don't bother him anymore, and we get the rest of that story. And that's something that Mark does a lot, where he joins things together. There's an interruption, and you're supposed to understand the middle based on what you read on the outside, and vice versa. And so there's a lot of things that we can know that Mark is doing, and a lot of times the arguments that scholars would have are just what things would qualify as that. But there's a whole lot of things that Mark's doing in making these story, or doing this narrative. He starts with the beginning of the gospel of Jesus Christ. And when we read through Mark, you get to the very end. And if you exclude the stuff that scholars have pretty much identified didn't originally exist, verses 9 through 20 of chapter 16, it's weird. You get to the end and you're like, what just happened? The women are at the tomb, and the angel, described as a man in white, tells them he's not here, he's risen. And he says, go and tell the disciples. And then all of a sudden and they went away afraid and told no one. The end. And we're like, what? And so you start thinking about, well, what is he doing? And the reason why we would say that 9 through 20 didn't exist originally was for a lot of reasons, but the earliest manuscripts don't have anything else, and then the ones that do have something else, there are several different versions. And so likely what happened was later on people didn't like that ending, they couldn't figure it out, it bothered them, and so they started taking some of the traditions from some of the other books and added them in there and finished out the rest, and almost everything in that is found in other Gospels, so it's not like just completely coming out of it, out of thin air with the details. But that's going on, and so we get to at the very beginning, and it says the beginning of the Gospel of Jesus Christ, and you start wondering, well, so is the whole Gospel here the beginning of the Gospel? Or is it just that statement at the beginning this is the beginning? Well, if that's the case, why would you write that? We know that's the beginning. That's where you started, right? So there's a whole lot of stuff that he's doing. And if you're reading it with a critical eye, you start recognizing some of these things that just kind of seem a little bit strange. Why would he do this? He's got heavy allusions to quotations of Isaiah and allusions to Isaiah. That was where I actually had started going with when I decided to teach tonight, was I was going to do that, and I just realized that was going to be weeks and weeks and weeks if we didn't just kind of brush over all of it. One of the main themes is the Jewish religious leaders are rejected while the Gentiles are accepted. You're going to read that kind of in between the lines all over the place, and part of that is the Isaiah allusions as well. And then the disciples are somewhere in between. So they're described as, well, they just don't get it. And you have Isaiah describing the people, the servant of God, being Israel, being blind and deaf, and they just don't understand. And they're not doing what God wants them to do. And then, so that's kind of cast in Mark at the religious leaders. But then the disciples are cast in this as well, sort of a mixture between the Gentiles and the religious leaders, kind of like, where are you going to end up? Where are you going to fall? And so they have a lot of this that's going on, where Jesus is constantly having to explain things to them privately, and then he's constantly asking them, do you not see it? Do you not are you not hearing? Do you not understand? Do you still not understand? And so we're going to see some of that tonight. I'm going to need some help here. So the next so we're going to go over the ghost story in Mark. I had never, this is where that article comes in if you're interested. One of those articles is on ghost stories of the time of Jesus. Throughout the ancient history, there were ghost things, stories, different things going on, and so this is from their culture. But Mark ties two of these stories together, if we're really paying attention. So I've titled this A Ghost on the Sea and Who Forgot the Bread? Or tie them both together and you get the message of hard-hearted disciples. Next slide. So this is the article that I'll reference. A lot of the ancient ideas that come out of this, or that actually are brought into this narrative. It's called A Ghost on the Water, Understanding an Absurdity, in Mark 6, 49 through 50. Next. I think you got to move the cursor over the right side or something. Okay. So, how do you tell a ghost story? When we get into genres, how do we tell a ghost story? If I tell a ghost story and it starts in the middle of the day at, whatever. Okay, so at night, right? What else? Okay, so you got the setting, right? You got night, you got possibly windy or stormy. You got a certain way that you got to tell a ghost story. Otherwise, you're just a hack. They're going to pass you over the next time it's time to tell ghost stories. They're going to ask somebody else because you just didn't do it right. So you got to tell ghost stories right. And so there are certain rules for telling ghost stories. And so if you break those rules, you're going to be called incompetent. Mark is going to play on this as he tells this story. So some of the rules: what time is it? Where does it happen? It might be in a cemetery, or these things that we automatically want to input in that. What weather is it? Are there disturbed spirits from the past? So you think about the ghost stories, and it's like, yeah, some guy lost his arm a long time ago, whatever. You think of those ghost stories, murders or whatever, and you always have to input those in there to tell a good ghost story. Next. So this is actually a Roman comedy, a play of Plautus, that Mark quite possibly is actually playing on a little bit here, or at least he's doing some of the same things. This is commonly called Mostelaria, or Haunted House. And this is the plot of the whole thing. Is Theopropides he's a father. He returns home early from a business trip, but his son Philolaches has been drinking with friends, all of whom are in a drunken stupor when the father returns. His servant Tranio comes to the rescue of the son by attempting to keep the father out of the house. Since the father is superstitious by nature, the servant decides to pretend the house is haunted. The story first follows the rules of ghost stories in time. What makes this comedy is, that Tranio, the servant, breaks all of the rules of ghost stories, but the father falls for everyone. So even the ones that are just completely absurd, he falls for it, and it makes the audience laugh because they're in the know that the son's just drunk and he's trying to cover it up and he's making this stuff up. And so he follows some of the rules, but then he breaks other ones, and that's what kind of makes it funny, is the father is kind of playing the idiot role. And that's what makes it funny, is that he's kind of the absurdity of it all. And so that's what makes it absurd, is where he deviates from how you tell a ghost story. So the story first follows the rules of ghost stories in the setting. So it's at night. He comes home early, and it's dimly lit by a torch. And this is an important detail because, like for us, if you tell a good ghost story when it has happened, it's like midnight or whatever. Back then, they didn't have the belief that ghosts glowed in the dark. So you couldn't see them unless you had a little bit of light. So it was either early morning just before the sun came up fully, so they had a little bit of light, or you had a torch or campfire or something like that. You had some small source of dimly lit something, so it's like sunrise or sunset, something like that, or just a little bit of light coming from fires or things like that in order to be able to see them. You couldn't see them if it was just pitch black. So the setting here, with it being dimly lit by a torch, is important. The ghost, according to Tranio, the servant, is a formerly murdered guest of the house. And so he's inputting these things in here to try to make it believable. But what makes this the comedy is where he breaks those, and so he has the ghost come in a dream, not in reality. Well, why would you be afraid of a ghost that's in your dream and not real ghost, right? So, and the father's falling for this, and then also the servant knows that the ghost is in the house, but he hasn't done the proper things to try and get rid of it. So he hasn't tried to give it a proper burial. And so the audience and the characters, and all the characters except for the father, know what's going on, and that's what makes it a comedy. So let's look at Mark chapter 6, starting in verse 30. We're actually going to, there's two stories going on here, and so we're going to hit both stories because they're both tied, but it's going to be kind of weird at first why we're going here first. But so the two stories are the feeding of the 5,000 and the story of Jesus walking on the water. Seem like separate stories, but they're tied by a statement that's made at the end of the walking on the water. So the apostles returned to Jesus and told him all that they had done and taught. And he said to them, "Come away by yourselves to a desolate place and rest a while." For many were coming and going, and they had no leisure even to eat. And they went away in the boat to a desolate place by themselves. Now many saw them going and recognized them, and they ran there on foot from all the towns and got there ahead of them. But when he went ashore, he saw a great crowd, and he had compassion on them because they were like sheep without a shepherd. And he began to teach them many things. And when it grew late, his disciples came to him and said, "This is a desolate place, and the hour is now late. Send them away to go into the surrounding countryside and villages and buy themselves something to eat." But he answered them, "You give them something to eat." And they said to him, "Shall we go and buy 200 denarii worth of bread and give it to them to eat?" And he said to them, "How many loaves do you have? Go and see." And when they had found out, they said, 5 and 2 fish. Then he commanded them all to sit down in groups on the green grass. So they sat down in groups by hundreds and by 50s. And taking the 5 loaves and the 2 fish, he looked up to heaven and said a blessing, and broke the loaves and gave them to the disciples to set before the people. And he divided the 2 fish among them all. And they all ate and were satisfied. And they took up 12 baskets full of broken pieces and all of the fish. And those who ate all the loaves were 5,000 men. Immediately he made his disciples get into the boat and go before him to the other side, to Bethsaida, while he dismissed the crowd. And after he had taken leave of them, he went on the mountain to pray. And when evening came, the boat was out on the sea, and he was alone on the land. And he said, and he saw that they were making headway painfully, for the wind was against them. And about the 4th watch of the night, he came to them, walking on the sea. He meant to pass by, but when they saw him walking on the sea, they thought it was a ghost, and cried out. For they all saw him and were terrified. But immediately he spoke to them and said, "Take heart, it is I. Do not be afraid." And he got into the boat with them, and the wind ceased. And they were utterly astounded, for they did not understand about the loaves, but their hearts were hardened. So, several things. Kurt, if you go back to the first scripture slide with Mark. First reading this, trying to figure out what's going on here. What is Mark doing? I recognized right away that this word desolate is all over the place. And Mark does a lot. There's a lot of wilderness stuff going on, and so right away my mind was taken to wilderness wandering, right? And actually I had talked with the teens about this, and this right here reminds me of the wilderness wanderings, because what's happening? Well, they're in a desolate place, and what's being fed to the people? Bread, right? And so it reminds us of the manna, right? And so it's possible that Mark is doing that. It's possible that Mark is doing something else. It's possible that Mark is doing all of it, all at the same time. So I just wanted to highlight that desolate place is in several different places, and this isn't the only place in Mark that phrase is used. And then the other thing is Jesus asks how many loaves they have. He doesn't ask about the fish. Thought that was kind of strange. A little bit, I'd never noticed that before, and it's kind of odd that he asks for the loaves and they say, "Yep, this and fish." But I think he's going to really be fixated on this loaves thing. Next slide. And then we get to the ghost part, the walking on the water, and it's the 4th watch of the night. So this is between 3 and 6 in the morning. About prime time for the sun just to be coming up. It's that time for when you might see a ghost, right? But the key phrase here, when they saw him walking on the sea, they thought it was a ghost. This is highlighted then in verse 52, for they did not understand about the loaves, but their hearts were hardened. And I always, when I first read this, it's like, that's another weird saying. Why do they have to be hard-hearted to mistake him for a ghost? Why couldn't they just be mistaken, superstitious? Whatever the situation is, why are they hard-hearted because they thought he was a ghost? Next slide. So what earns the disciples the description of hard-hearted in this narrative of Jesus walking on the water? So first we look at the setting of the story, the 4th watch of the night. It's perfect time for a ghost. It's stormy. It's perfect time for a ghost, right? The only other detail in the setting is really the location. Next slide. So water is the one detail in the narrative that brings the comedy to the idea that Jesus could possibly be a ghost. This is brought out in this article that I mentioned. When they saw him walking on the sea, they thought it was a ghost. This would be utterly ridiculous to anybody at the time, with everything that they knew about ghosts. In ancient ghost genre, ghosts could never cross water. Any of the tales, any of the mythology, ghosts never walked on water. And we actually would understand some of this because if you think about what we do know about Greek mythology, that sort of stuff, what's the river that the dead pass that they can't come back? They cross on the ferry. The river Styx. So they go across. They got to pay the ferryman because they can't walk across it themselves. But they're never going to come back. And that plays on this same theme about ghosts can't walk on water. They can't cross water. In fact, if they go to the water, they're actually going to be sucked down into the abyss, and they're basically go to Hades. They're done. No coming back from it. However, the one really, really important detail to tie in with that ghosts can't walk on water, is that when you look at ancient mythology, you've got Hercules, who's the son of Zeus, son of a god, Euphemus, the son of Poseidon, Orion, the son of Poseidon, and Neptune, or Poseidon himself. They all walk on water, or Poseidon rides his chariot on the water. And so the point that all of these gods or sons of gods in ancient mythology are the only ones that ever are on water, coupled with the fact that ghosts are never seen on water, is probably where the idea that Mark is playing on, that they're hard-hearted, because they chose to see something that was utterly absurd versus something that they all knew or would recognize as, well, yeah, the gods and the sons of the gods, those are the ones that walk on the waters. So Mark flips the script there, and he takes the story and he gives them, yep, this is a perfect ghost story. It's right early in the morning, just before the sun comes up. It's windy or stormy. It's, all this stuff, but then he throws in that detail about it being on the sea, and it makes it utterly ridiculous, especially when they should be seeing Jesus for who he really is. And if you look at even the ancient mythology, it would show Jesus for who he is. And so, especially when you start looking into like some of the mythology and things and how they seem to actually help point the Gentiles to Yahweh. When you really dig deep into it. So this is going on in that story, and we get that hard-hearted comment at the end. Next slide, Kurt. So the recognition here, the point is that all of these were gods or sons of gods in ancient mythology that walked on water. The disciples were hard-hearted to the point where they couldn't recognize divinity when they saw it. In fact, they reached for the only explanation that could never work. So then what about the loaves? So if we go back to verse 51 and 52, starting towards the end of 51, it says, "And they were utterly astounded, for they did not understand about the loaves, but their hearts were hardened." So this is tying the story back to the feeding of the 5,000 with the loaves. And so Mark seems just fixated on this idea of loaves, of the bread. Jesus asks if they have any loaves. He doesn't ask about the fish. That's something that the disciples input into the conversation. Later in Mark 8, when we have the feeding of the 4,000, this also centers on the loaves. He doesn't ask about the fish again. And those two stories play on each other. So when Jesus provides the loaves, God's people eat and are satisfied, and there is more than what is needed. Let's go to another story. Let's go to 2 Kings. 2 Kings chapter 4. This is a story of Elisha. Second Kings chapter 4, verse 38. And we're going to see something that maybe is being played on here by Mark. I'm going to throw it out as a possibility and just let you kind of grind away at it. The idea that I think Mark is doing here is trying to teach about recognition of Jesus. What do we recognize him as? And so starts out in verse 38, and Elisha came again to Gilgal where there was a famine in the land. And then it goes into this other narrative that we're going to skip over, but this gives a setting that they're in famine. There's famine in the land. He's down by Jericho, or Gilgal in Jericho area is where he's mostly been in this. And there's famine in the land, and so it kind of reminds me of that desolate place part, right? So you got Mark. Maybe that's where Mark is going with this. Verse 42, a man came from Baal Shalishah, bringing the man of God bread of the first fruits. So he's bringing these loaves to Elisha. 20 loaves of barley and fresh ears of grain in his sack. And Elisha said, give to the men that they may eat. But his servant said, how can I set this before 100 men? So he repeated, give them to the men that they may eat. For thus says the Lord, they shall eat and have some left. So he set it before them, and they ate and had some left, according to the word of the Lord. This small little narrative in Elisha's story, where Elisha's brought 20 loaves. He's got 100 men. Now, these aren't loaves like, loaves. They're flatbread loaves, most likely. That's what they ate. And so Elisha's brought, think of 20 pancakes, and he's got to feed 100 men. How far is that going to go? And so right away, his servant's like, you've got to be crazy. Set this before 100 men. And he tells them, well, God's already said that they're going to eat and they're going to have some left. Kurt, would you go back to the end of the Mark verse? The one before that, I think, actually. Oh, you were right the first time. In verse 41, and taking the 5 loaves and 2 fish, he looked up to heaven and said a blessing and broke the loaves and gave them to the disciples to set before the people. And he divided the 2 fish among them all. And they all ate and were satisfied. And they took up 12 baskets full of broken pieces and of the fish, and those who ate the loaves were 5,000 men. So we have a similar situation here, but magnified from the Elisha story. Elisha takes 20 loaves and feeds 100 men, so like 5 people sharing the same loaf. And then Jesus takes 5 loaves and 2 fish and feeds 5,000 men. So it's magnified significantly if this is what Mark is doing. If he's playing off of this, which to me, the details in here are very strong allusions back to this story. If he's playing off of this, he's significantly magnifying Jesus over Elisha. And so then when we tie that, we know that this story must be tied, or the Mark loaf story must be tied with the walking on the water story because of the comment at the end, because they didn't understand the loaves. So they have to be tied together, but why? What's the tying there? What's important about the two? How do we join them? And so when we look at recognition of Jesus, first, he's no ghost. Second, he's not a mere prophet. And so we have Elisha, one of the great prophets. And Jesus, he's done, you look through his stories, and it's just one thing of him providing after the next. He's living during this famine all over the land, and he's continually providing for those around him. And this is one of those incidents where he feeds the 100 men with the 20 loaves. But Jesus is not just a mere prophet. He's magnified way, way above and beyond. Kurt, is that the last slide? Okay. Any thoughts on any of this stuff? Like I said, I'm kind of throwing some of this stuff out. This is kind of what we've been doing some with the Mark scroll. trying to ask questions and let it lead where it does. When you're reading through the Gospels, when you're reading through any of the Scriptures, really anything else for that matter, you really should be looking for what's being said here, what's being done. Because it's not just a strict detail thing. Mark is very scant on details. His is the shortest gospel at 16 chapters, and it's very, abrupt. In fact, Josh, what's the word that he uses 40 times? Immediately. Mark is on a mission there, and I think what he's trying to get at is Jesus is on a mission. Right from the very beginning, it's immediately this, and then immediately that, and sometimes it's a couple verses right after another that he does that in. But Mark is doing something with his gospel, and I would say that the other writers are doing things as well, not just strictly reporting the details, but they're actually creating, putting something together that helps us to see more than just what the words say.
Yep. Yeah, and then I got to thinking about in 1 Kings 17, Elijah and the widow of Zarephath.
Mm-hmm.
And how her jar of flour and oil were not spent.
Yeah.
And it was by the word of the Lord, and at the end, verse 16, the jar of flour was not spent, neither did the jug of oil become empty according to the word of the Lord that he spoke by Elijah. So the Lord,
Yep.
Elijah was speaking for him because of that. So the word therefore here. So very similar to Jesus walking across the water. They
Yeah.
were freaked out by it, and so I never knew that about Greek mythology.
Yeah, I didn't until I read this article. Again, if anybody's interested in these, we can get copies made. They're not super short. They're not super long. They're a little bit on the elevated reading. But if you're interested, let me know, and we'll get copies to you. Actually, I probably have them on PDF as well. Something else, even to add into that conversation, is Elijah and Elisha both crossed the Jordan, and even they don't walk on the water. And so it's possibly that is even at play here. They walk on dry land. Remember Elisha's cloak, and it divides the water again. And so again, with that story, you even get the Israelite crossing of the Red Sea and those sort of themes coming back into the story. But then you have this play on Jesus walking on the water, which ghosts can't do. Even the prophets don't do it. They're walking on dry ground. Yeah. And maybe he's doing something with that. Maybe he's not. Like I said, I was kind of throwing some of these things out to think about and to kind of prod you a little bit to, when you're reading, be looking for those phrases that seem just a little bit strange to you. Those are usually, if you're reading closely and something kind of hits you as strange, it's there for a reason. What was it that Mike Heiser says? That,
If it's weird, it's important.
yeah, if it's weird, it's important. So, when you're reading, if there's something that kind of tugs at you when you're reading, there's probably something there, probably something that you should be looking for. And, I've read this account of Mark with the bread and the loaves and the walking on the water so many times, and it's always been two separate stories to me. They just happened on the same day and whatever, but then all of a sudden I caught that little phrase that I'd never caught before. That, because they were hard-hearted, and I'm like, I would maybe fall into the camp of, well, is he a ghost, but then still start looking back into the details of it. Any other thoughts? If you are interested in taking a look at the scroll and what we're doing up there, we'll have it laid out at different times, working on it usually on Wednesday nights. And like I said, it's 25 feet long, so it takes up 4 long tables stretched out. That's why the 4 tables are out there a lot. And so Kurt, I apologize if we don't put them up before ping pong sometime. But that's what we're doing up there, and we got a lot of stuff highlighted. Some of it may mean some stuff, and some of it may mean nothing, because a lot of it's kind of, we're looking to kind of experiment and see if certain things are being played on. For example, one of the things I had read one time that somebody was saying that Mark is probably playing on the idea of clothing. And so I thought, okay, we'll highlight clothing in one color and just take a look and see what we find. So far, I don't see anything necessarily in that. Maybe there's something to it. But we're experimenting. We're taking a look and reading through that. And then we get to the end and we go back to the beginning and we're reading other things and we're looking for those structural things that help to tell the story other than just in the words. So if you're interested in taking a look at that, Wednesday nights when we got it open, just come on up.